Let's start.
Okay.
So maybe shall I give a short intro and then we can take it from there.
Okay.
So thank you everyone and a happy Friday to all of you. Thank you for joining today's session. I'm really excited about this session because, and especially for Kristel, because Kristel is a person that I stumbled on because of a systemic design toolkit, which is open sourced. You can find links to it. And that set off a flurry of activity for us because it resonated with us as to how we can deal with complex problems. And that helped us to reach out to Kristel. And in Kristel, we found a person, an expert, an authority in the field who is so humble and generous with her knowledge. And that's something that stood out over and over again with us is that, her generosity. And I hope that today, uh, that same feeling, the same passion for systemic design and the generous sharing would touch you all as well. So Kristel is the co-founder of a design agency called Namahn, and she's also one of the lead authors of the Systemic Design Toolkit, and really an authority in the field and making a big difference. So highly, very privileged to have Kristel here with us to introduce systemic design, and then to have a chat with us on how we can, here in Singapore, can take this practice forward. So with that, welcome, Kristel.
Okay. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, I will share my screen. So Maisha also already introduced me, but I also teach at the University of Antwerp, and basically that's where it started because in 2012 they asked me to help to teach product service systems, which combines product design and service design. And then I couldn't find enough methodology for the system, so I started to look into cybernetics, and from there a whole new toolkit grew, which is now called the Systemic Design Toolkit. So I'm a partner at Namahn. We are a human-centered design agency, and we do interaction design, service design, and systems design, systemic design, basically. Then complex issues. So we don't have to explain you, I think we are facing more and more complex issues in society, which we also called wicked problems like climate change, migration, but also Corona. And with the conventional ways of problem solving, we cannot solve those problems. So we even make it worse. So we have to find new ways. And that's why systemic design is an interesting methodology. You can easily see when you read the newspapers with the systemic design attitude, when you see titles like this, it's typically, that this is a systemic design problem, things that people are trying to solve since years, but it doesn't work. Or even it goes even in the wrong, it gets even worse. And you also see that more and more organizations also struggle with this complexity and with wicked problems. So what is then systemic design? Systemic design is about complexity, and it's complexity in a lot of things. It's complexity in causes, multiple stakeholders, multiple mindsets, a lot of product, services, rules, regulations working together as a whole. And this leads to an emergent behavior that is not intended by any of the parts themselves, but is emerging from the systems. And nobody really understands very well how this comes and how to intervene on this. And so what systemic design is basically doing, it's integrating the methodologies from basically systems thinking and human-centered design thinking so that you can grasp this complexity. And as I told in the beginning, we are now adding things, for example, from behavioral science, psychology. And so The big difference between systems thinking and design thinking is that systems thinking focuses on the whole. It focuses on the relationships between everything in the system and how they influence each other and the whole. Design thinking, on the other hand, focuses on parts. Traditional design focuses on products, on services, so really on parts, and then tries to see how to create optimal user experience with those parts. And so if you combine this, you get systemic design. And what you do in the systemic design process is continuously zoom out and zoom in. Zoom in on the parts, zoom out on the whole. And try then to make an intervention model that can change the behavior of the system. And so when is it useful? I must say, as a disclaimer, that with systemic design, you cannot solve problems. You cannot solve a system. You can also only help a system to go into the right directions toward its purpose. And it's also never finished. The system always changes. So you have also to design ways to give the system the tools to adapt itself. It's useful when you have a lot of messy context, multiple aspects involved, multiple parties, multiple interested and perspectives. When you see this, you can see that there is a potential for systemic design. And you also can see that there is a potential when you have those symptoms. So there is an escalation of the issue. People are addressing the symptoms instead of the real causes. Initiatives are working against each other. There is really a focus on short-term and incremental improvement. There is a resistance to change from the established system, and there is stagnation, uncertainty, and fear. So there are all things that give you a hint like this is a systemic design problem. So how can we then intervene by design? Well, I think there are three levels to intervene by design. The first level is at least understand how the parts influence the system. So if you design things, that you try to understand if there are no unintended consequences. The level two is to create subsystems that influence the whole. So for example, here in Brussels, we have a bike carrying system, which helps to change the attitudes toward mobility. And then a third level is really using design to really leverage change in the whole organizational of our societal system. Some examples, what things we did. So this was an exercise where we, it was a project of 24 months where we look how we could foster integration in Flanders. And this is, for example, an exercise where we are looking what are all already initiatives that are emerging, so new innovative initiatives. So we're looking what is the capacity we can build on. This is another exercise we did. Here we helped pregnant women in poverty to make use of the care system. And this is a picture of the design studio where we were trying to figure out the interviews and making a system map and seeing how everything is connected. This was a project for Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, so to foster hand hygiene in field hospitals worldwide. And then this is a project for a European Agency for Innovation, where they were reinventing the whole way of working of their organization, so to foster innovation in the SMEs in Europe. Then about the methodology. So I created a toolkit together in collaboration with Shift10, which is a systems thinking agency in Leuven in Belgium, Mars, which is an innovation lab in Canada, and then the System Design Association. So that's basically Peter Jones and other people behind the Systemic Design Annual Conference. And so why a toolkit? Well, you have, when you do systemic change, you have to do this much more than in other design projects with your stakeholders, with the actors of the system in the room. You have to do it together with them. And why? Because they are the ones that will have to implement the change. And so as systemic design is quite difficult to grasp, I made tools so that everybody can understand the principles behind them without having to go to all the literature and all the papers of all the systems thinking writers. And so the toolkit basically consists now about 40 tools, and there are 7 basic steps. The first step, you try to see what is in the system, who are the actors involved, what is the context. Then you go out and you do interviews and observations to understand what are the contributing factors. You bring them together in a system map. You try to understand what are the leverage points. Then you make it explicit what you want to achieve by defining the desired future. Then you go into the possibility space, like exploring on what levels can we intervene to get to this desired future. Then you go very practical. You translate your intervention strategy into an intervention model. And then the last step is about how can I put this new intervention model into the existing system. So how can I make this transition happen? And so this is another way to look at it. Basically in the middle, you want to go to another future, and everything you do. So the 3 steps you do before is like, how do we get in this mess today? And then how do we get out of this mess is what you do after this. Well, how do we get out of it as much as possible? And so there are some examples of tools. This is a first one for the framing. This is based on all my tools are based on paper. So this is based on a paper of a Dutch professor. And for example, this is an exercise you do in the beginning, where in the middle, you are trying to see why is the system under pressure? Why do we have to change the system? Then around it, you are going to look at how is the actual regime dealing with these challenges. And then you will look around what are emerging new initiatives that are doing things on a new way. A second tool is about making system maps, and that's quite a tough one. And it's where you really try to understand what are the story loops in the system and how are they all connected to each other. And in the end, you want to find out what are the leverage points. So what are the places in the system where there's the most potential to intervene. This is another tool, which is the intervention strategy based on a paper of Donella Meadows, which was a very well-known systems thinker of the 20th century. And she has a very nice paper, which is called Places to Intervene in the System, where she explains the layers where you can intervene. So I made a tool out of this to help you to think like, okay, if we want to make changes on this leverage point, should we change the goals? Should we change the rules? Should we change the paradigms? Should we change the loops? Should we change the structures, etc.? And then a last example that I want to give you is transition by design. And this is a tool basically where you're trying to think, how can we put the intervention model in the system? So you start with a full model with every element there, but in a kind of minimal version. So you can experiment and test what works and what doesn't work. And then you make it grow. For example, it can become more and more sophisticated, more digital tools. You think about which stakeholders you want to involve. In the beginning, you want your friends, but because your baby is still very fragile, and but the more and more it grows, you can open up, and at the end, even involve enemies. And then at the bottom, you think what activities are needed to empower your actors and stakeholders to learn and act in the system. Yeah, and then what we also do, of course, is help out clients with trainings, boot camps, projects, coachings, etc. in systemic design. So you can download the core tools of the toolkit. You can download them here, systemicdesigntoolkit.org. All right.
Okay, that was wonderful. Thank you, Kristel. Now, for the rest of the session, here's what I suggest. if anyone has a question, since we are a small group, I think we can go ahead and ask, or I'll keep a watch on the Slido page. This is on the chat window. You can see that Vasu has posted a page on Slido where we are capturing some of the questions. So I have a bunch of questions on Slido. I can start with that, but I thought if anyone has got a question now, please go for it.
Is okay that I ask a question?
Yes. Hello.
All right. Hello. Maish, Wolfgang, first of all, thanks for creating this 5-day email course, because it was really exciting stuff, very interesting, that brought us to today. And since I'm also from Belgium, from Antwerp, it's great to hear Kristel on the other side of the world talking about Universiteit van Antwerp, University of Antwerp. So great to meet you, Kristel. And maybe, a question, what's maybe for you the key difference between design thinking and systemic design? Because you showed a couple of examples, but if you then think about, for example, IDEO, they also could come with examples. Yeah, we help the government here with this, we help these big multinationals with that. So maybe they also approached wicked problems. But what's for you the added value of approaching a wicked value with systemic design, and what things you need to have to make that a success?
But first of all, IDEO is using systems thinking. Huh?
Okay.
They even have a Japanese part of their organization that is really focused on systems thinking. So they haven't made a toolkit of it, but they bought my toolkit. They downloaded the toolkit, by the way, one of the first who did it. I think the fourth one or something like that. Well, for me, the big difference is that you don't look at your products and services as standalone things, but you look at them in the broader system. And of course, it's only needed if there is this complexity. But you really want to see, like, how can we use products and service to leverage change into the whole system? And besides of products and services, you also go looking to other things. Should the rules be changed? Should the goal of the system be changed, for example? So it's looking much broader. Is that an answer to your question?
That's an answer. Maybe what's one tool you maybe less use or don't use at all in design thinking, which you then use in systemic design to actually look at the whole and the impact of the whole and the evolution and its force, etc.
The system map is the most different one. Yeah. It's also the most difficult one, I must say. And then there is also this whole theory of transition that is not used in design thinking, which is quite important in systemic design, because it's the system itself that has to change. You don't end up in the design thinking, you can say, oh, this is your product. Well, in digital design, it also adapts, but in systemic design, you cannot say this is the solution. It's more a kind of intervention mixed with a lot of variations, and then the stakeholders can take this and work with that and adapt to their context and adapt to the changes in time, basically.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Kristel. Just to follow up on Wesley's question. So I've noticed in some of the readings of late, and especially with the release of Simon Sinek's Infinite Game, that they relate systemic design to an infinite game. What's your take on that, Kristel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, changing a system never stops. Huh? The system is constantly evolving and is what they call purpose seeking. There is no one defined purpose, but somewhere it's a meander towards a possible, well, a probably ideal purpose. And so it's continuously, you have to adapt, but every system does that already, but not consciously or less consciously.
Okay.
I'll jump in with a question. Hi, Kristel. My name is Gerald. I'm from PebbleRoad. And we sometimes work with organizations that are a bit regulatory in nature. And when we deal with these organizations, we do encounter teams that are a bit more, I would say, enlightened in their thinking. And then there are other parts of the organization where the goals are still very much on monitoring, regulation, which I think is important, right? I don't know if you've experienced multiple departments coming together and some of them coming from a let's go with a system that trusts, a trust paradigm, right? Versus a system that is no trust, right? We should monitor. And I'm wondering whether you've had, I guess, cases like that where you had to kind of resolve or not resolve is the wrong word for it, move the system in the right direction.
Yeah, the case from the pregnant woman was, for example, like that. One of the biggest leverage points in this system was trust, where basically the women didn't go to the care system because of the distrust, because they were very afraid that if they went to the care system, their baby was going to be taken away. And so we had to really change that paradigm. And so to think about how can we then change the system so that these women will trust. And so we were very much inspired by bottom-up initiatives where midwives were basically in contact with those women already today. And they are really trusted by the women because they are perceived as outside of the care system. And so then we did a whole program where we introduced these midwives into the system, among other things. Yeah.
I see. And were there shifts in policy with regard to regulation or enforcement?
Yeah. There were changes in policy in that way. Yeah. The government on the federal level picked it up, and it became the new way of working in Belgium. Yeah.
Very nice.
I mean, before the project, they hardly knew about each other. So the government system hardly knew that this bottom-up initiatives existed, and they didn't speak with each other. And so the project changed this.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Could you add to that how long that process took?
The project itself, or the process?
The change from the governments going from being slightly fragmented to becoming more connected.
Very quickly.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the project was 3 months, the first project. And then a couple of months later, the federal government asked me to conduct a workshop with these bottom-up initiatives and them. And then they thought they were so different. And then I used one of my paradox cards and I say, you have the paradox bottom-up, top-down, and you have to connect them. I mean, if you connect the government recommendations with the bottom-down initiatives, you can really create a reinforcing loop where the bottom-up initiatives inform from their practices what the guidelines could be, and then the guidelines could share it back. The government could share it back to all the different bottom-up initiatives. And they all had an aha moment on that workshop. And they were, yeah, yes, that's it. And they did it. Maybe I had a good bunch of people in the room, huh? But it was really done immediately after that.
Yeah, so the other area that I think it might apply to would be nonprofits, right? Because between government and nonprofit, there tends to be a funding that's going on. The government funds the nonprofits here in Singapore for certain KPIs. So I'm wondering also whether systemic design can come into play where government can revise the way they fund the programs and the models.
Well, what I see in Belgium is that if government funds programs, it's very scattered. And what you could do with systemic design is make a system map upfront to see the whole landscape of these NGOs and what is needed as subsidies, as fundings, and then also try to connect the different initiatives together. And another thing that what happens in Belgium is all these fundings are like for 4 years and then they stop. which is very stupid. Because all the learnings, all the good practices are done just in a drawer, and there is nothing done with this. So also this, you can use all this knowledge to make evolve, to build up best practices, to share cases, again, to connect all the initiatives together. Yeah, that's really a big problem in Belgium. I don't know if it's Singapore. It's a lot of waste of money here.
Yeah. Would anyone like to comment on on our Singapore projects? Yeah, I guess there's a lot of wastage here as well.
Mhm.
I'd like to pick up on two things that were mentioned earlier. One was you mentioned that it takes 3 months, around 3 months, you know, that pregnancy work that you did. So it was 3 months, then another workshop and another workshop. So how long does, you know, what's the shape of a systemic project? How does it feel like? What are the, I know you mentioned the 7 stages,
Mhm.
but does it go on for like 3 months? Is that the typical time frame, or sometimes it goes on for longer?
Sometimes it goes on for longer. It depends a little bit on how many stakeholders you want to involve, what the budget is, and especially the last part, the transition. I mean, going up to the intervention model, you can do this in 3 to 6 months, but then the transition can take years. So that
Okay.
depends a bit. Yeah.
Okay. And then you mentioned in passing about having the right people in the room. So how important is it? I mean, have you come across a project where it didn't go too well simply because there were the wrong people in the room?
For the moment, not.
Is there a particular prerequisite on selecting the right people in the room? You know?
Yeah, I will show you. Wait. Where is my screen? I will show you the tool that I use for that for the moment, because my tools are constantly evolving.
Mhm.
Okay, I'll share my screen again. It's this one. Who should be involved in the dialogue? And so we also use this to select people to interview. So, I mean, I like this framework. So you want to interview people with less or more power, less or more legitimacy, less or more knowledge, less or more dynamism, less or more interest, less or more urgency, to understand the different perspectives on the topic. But in your room, you would like to have the ones with the most of everything.
Okay.
For example, somebody with a lot of knowledge on the topic, somebody with a lot of power to be able to change the system, somebody who really feels the urgency for change. So that's how I now select the kind of stakeholders I want to have in the room.
Okay, that's a nice one. So we're using that tool, we can set up ourselves for success. So because you have the right people in the room.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess, sorry, follow-on question on the tooling as you're just sharing this. When you're working, if you have to work remotely via Zoom, how do you conduct, are you able to conduct these workshops? How do you facilitate them?
Well, it's not the same, of course, but yes, we do this on Miro, on big Miro boards with Post-its, and I did it with Maish like that. So yes, it works. It's not that good, but it works.
All right, thanks.
The most difficult thing is when clients ask to have hybrid workshops. That's hell.
So hybrid would be, yeah, you meet for a few sessions and then everything else is on.
No, That's okay. No, hybrid meaning some people are physically
Oh,
there and some people are online. We had our first hybrid workshop last week with Justice because they really insisted. We learned a lot. For example, we learned that then it's better to do the 2 parallel sessions and only share the insights afterwards. We now try to bring them then together and share after each exercise, and it was really impossible.
okay.
Mhm.
Okay, so that leads me to one of the findings on remote work. They said that from a company point of view, if one person is remote, everyone is remote.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Vasu, you're asking a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So in terms of the engagement, seems like the transition is something that's going to take a long time. Do you continue the engagement with while the organization is going through that transition phase, and or
Sometimes,
on their own?
not often, because it costs money, and often the client is then on a moment that he knows how to do it himself.
Okay.
And yeah, and often in clients or the clients we have, they come, for example, from management, etc. And so they are more acquainted with this kind of ways of thinking. But with the integration pact, for example, we did this for 20 months. Yeah. Mm.
Okay. Just as a follow-up on that question, I've seen from the photographs and I've seen from the other material that you've got is that these sessions are quite intensive sessions. There are a lot of people and they're doing a lot of work, right? Whether it is building the system map or taking part in these conversations. And you also mentioned that at some point they need to take over because the system is never done. It keeps moving. So in your projects or from the client's point of view, is there a deliberate attempt to kind of learn these skills? Do they send their teams for systemic design training or stuff like that? Or is it part of the process?
Well, it's a part of the process, but we also have clients who really ask for coaching along with the project, coaching and training, so that they really can do it themselves. Yeah, and that's the best, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We want to learn to fish.
Right. Right.
Kristel,
That's
do you have
Gandhi, I think.
do you have most of the engagement around wicked problems on societal level, like with government agencies, governmental bodies, or we also work with companies in the private sector, like multinationals, and working with them on? It's a couple of questions in a go. Sorry for that, but could you also work with systemic design with multinationals and say, let's change the way we work, let's change a bit our culture and see how our culture works today, what are our bottlenecks, and with systemic design alter that process?
Yes, you can. I must say most of the questions we get are from the social sector or from a lot from government, because few companies are in the systemic design mind yet. They are still struggling with circular economy and they think it's good enough. But for example, we got a request from an electronics company in Brussels, in Europe, and they wanted to change their internal culture into circular economy, in this case into sustainability. And we investigated with systems thinking what internally in the company were the leverage points and the barriers for this change. And for example, you could see that there were conflicting incentives. For example, the designers were got incentives if the assembly went quickly, and of course, it doesn't help for disassembly because then they will use glue and things like that. Or for example, they all their service after sales was outsourced beyond the company. So they didn't have a good view on how their customers were using their products. And there was also not a kind of service for repair, for example, in place. that they controlled. And that was very interesting to see. We also found, for example, that the mindset of management, it's a typical one, was very much short term. And so to have the return on investment on this sustainability, it's rather long term. And yeah, it was very interesting to see that.
So maybe I could add on to the question from Wesley, because in the earlier example you gave about the government in the workshop where there was a very quick positive outcome, is that not uncommon, or was that an exception? So would systemic design be better for long-term, better settled, stable outcomes, or is it agnostic? You can apply it to quick turnarounds or long-term ambitions equally?
It's a good question. I prefer to apply it for long-term ambitions. I mean, it's long-term outcomes, because, for example, for this woman, on the short term, you can implement something, but the outcome is on the longer term, of course. But I also see that especially government is really ready to pick it up, because they've been struggling such a long time. And when they see this kind of systemic design modeling, they see that initiatives that they already did are coming together, and it makes completely sense for them. Mm-hmm.
Now, my question comes from the fact that in our government, in our public, private, or government sector work, of course, lots of clients are hoping for quick outcomes, but invariably a good outcome, a good stable outcome. And like we were saying earlier, sometimes often it's cultural in nature. They take time. And a big part of what we all do is managing expectations on, or reframing what is a good outcome, you know. And if you want something quick, it can be done, but it may not be so sustainable. Transition will be much harder.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there is where the behavioral design, behavioral change science come in. I think you can help to get quick, I'm still investigating this. I think you can have quick changes using behavioral science nudging, along with longer term systemic changes. So I think it could work. We are going to try it out now with the Flemish government.
Can I build on that? Because I'm far from an expert in systemic field, because you have many different movements and philosophies. And the way I personally stumbled on systemic was through coaching, where I discovered systemic coaching coming from Bert Hellinger, the German psychologist who created an entire movement around systemic coaching, saying you have a unit conscious or an individual conscious, you have a system conscious. The system also wants things. You have an evolutionary force. You see a lot of coaching going on today, which is called constellations, like organizational constellations, and you do a lot of phenomenological observations. Are you aware of that stream, Kristel, as well? Do you tap into that approach, or is that something you have not been interacting with?
Not those frameworks. I'm working with a bunch of people around the University of Zurich about seeing how we can help stakeholders to go into a learning and action mode. And for example, one of the frameworks we use is the proximal development, the zone of proximal development. So where you try to see what is the capacity of the group today, what are the roles of the group today, and within this capacity and roles, what should each person needs to go to the next step. So that's one of the things we are trying to figure out now.
I agree. Yeah, because the thing for me is you have maybe the will, a conscious will of an individual or a small group in a bigger whole, but the bigger whole unconsciously also wants to reach his destination. And through systemic interventions, it's much more about creating movement so the system can move in the desired it wants than pushing it and giving direction. So that's a bit,
yeah,
I think, my personal feeling on, do you want short-term results? Do you want success, or do you want mastery? And I think the mastery is more letting things become loose and see how it goes, and maybe it goes in the total different direction than you were hoping or thinking, but then the thing moves, and rather than trying to push things. So that's for me the very intriguing things in systems that have a lot of conscious knowledge, but also a lot of unconscious knowledge.
But one of the toughest things to do is to have this unconscious will, as you say. But it's not difficult in the small group that you in the beginning of the project, because then you have this friends and these peoples with urgency and knowledge, etc. But if you grow your system into the existing regime, then it becomes very it's not easy to change the mindset of a whole society. And I am a big believer about changing the language and really looking at what language is used today and how could we change this bit by bit. But that's really something that has to come from the politicians and from the government. For example, here in Belgium, when the politicians speak about migration, they use the metaphor of surgery. So you have to cut it away, for example. It has to clean up to the bone. And so unconsciously, you give the population this metaphor of cancer, which is not helping with the polarization, of course.
No. Because they say also in systems, even if you remove something, it will never disappear. Somebody dies, somebody is pushed away. They still remain part of the system, and by ignoring it, you actually are enforcing it, because ignoring
you cannot ignore it.
It's a conscious decision to do something. Yeah?
No, you should not ignore contradictions. You should embrace them. And that's where the paradox cards come in. I made a set of paradox cards where that can help you to identify like what side of the paradox is the system dominant in. And then you'd really think, how can I use the other side of the system? How can I embrace the other perspective? So you really have to take into account all perspectives in the system. Otherwise, the system will push back even harder. So if you want...
an example of a paradox and why, I mean, we got those, and thank you very much. Very good set of cards. But to those who are trying to order Kristel's cards, we made the mistake of getting one pack. So you got to order multiple packs. So just Kristel, as an example of how and why a paradox is important, and an example of that.
Well, an example was in the care system, where you could, that's the bottom-up, top-down is very often there. So there were top-down initiatives, top-down guidelines, there are bottom-up initiatives, and they are not connecting and not learning, for example, from each other. So, for example, we did a project, it was a student thesis. She did a project on the way that here in the West, we give subsidies to NGOs in the southern countries. Then there are measurements and pilot projects on the field, but they are not connected, they are not learning from each other. And this is really a very, very often happening. Yeah.
Okay.
Another one that I like a lot is the paradox of control and trust, where people think that they have to choose between control and trust, and basically you can very much combine them.
Okay.
Somewhere on the internet there is an article of me about the paradox cards.
Okay, we'll look it up, and then we're gonna put it on the chat window. So that's on the. And you mentioned that we can't run away from these paradoxes. In fact, we need to embrace them. Same thing with contradictions. We need to embrace the contradictions. We can't run away from it. And in passing, a few minutes ago, Kristel, you mentioned that this popularity of systemic design, and you mentioned in passing that not everyone gets it, or not everyone is in the systems mindset. Who are the kinds of people that get it, and who are the kind of people that don't get it, and what can we do to kind of help them to see that perhaps there's a better way of addressing these problems?
Well, that's why I made the tools, huh? To help to get it, because the systems thinking as such is very hard. Google says that only 5% of the population can grasp it.
Okay.
I did a poll with my students last week, and we are up to 66% with the toolkit.
That's cool.
But some don't grasp it. Some cannot really, do not understand this mindset.
And what are the stumbling blocks? What's the real big stumbling block, do you think?
Not one is, I think, not wanting to embrace this complexity. Like, no, I don't want to go there. This is too much for me. This is. I also see it even within my own company. It took 3 years for my colleagues to pick it up, because it was like, no, this is really too high. This is too much. Also, you need to be curious about a lot more things than only design. You need to understand change management, for example. You need to understand business models much better. So you need to understand much more the business and government context than in a normal design project. And then it's also a whole other way to do interviews, because you want really to understand the dynamics within the system. What is escalating? What is stabilizing the system so that it's not changing? How are factors influencing each other? So it's a whole other way.
I found your interview toolkit quite fascinating, and would you mind sharing that so that at least we can get the context of, because from a design thinking point of view, we just do interviews and we capture the findings and we take it forward. But I like the way your toolkit shows interviews where you had two personas, and you were focusing more on the relationship between these two personas. Well, whether it is the teacher and the student, or it's between the students, you were focusing on the relationship. What is one giving? What is one getting? I remember that clearly. So, so that was, I mean, for us, just simply to grasp is that it's always about the connection. It's always about the relationships, right? And these relationships are in constant flux. So for us, I mean, trying to grasp systems design for the first time, that was quite challenging.
Well, you still can use personas in systems thinking. You still can do that, but the actants are very interesting to see how the relationships are influencing this. So that's quite interesting. So for example, for justice, I will now do an exercise to investigate, for example, what is the relationship between a judge and a bailey. No, not the bailey, the greffier, the griff, the guy, the clerks.
Okay.
Yeah. So because apparently there are a lot of tensions between them, and I want to understand why, and then see if we can do something to solve those tensions. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I think this is a very interesting topic you touched upon there. Gives a lot to think when you say people's willingness in embracing the bigger picture. And I mean, to me, it resonates back to all this. Well, it almost makes me wonder about how much there is a age gap in a way as well. If I think of the Fridays for Future movements and all these kind of other things that are happening currently. I mean, have you this is, I don't know, I don't even know how to phrase the question yet, right? But like, I mean, I think this is something that obviously as humanity we've dealt with for a long time, but always struggled. Is there any other, have you come across any other movements that have actually been able to tackle this better?
The understanding of complexity, I think the school system is very much to blame, because one of the most important causes of the fact that people are not able to grasp this complexity is because we learned the Cartesian way of thinking. Break everything up into pieces and look at everything separately. If you explain systemic design to 5-year-olds, they get it. At 8, they don't get it anymore.
Wow. Okay.
Mhm. So that's why behind me you have this whole wall of rabbits. It's a bit on hold now because of the other book, but I'm writing a children's book to explain 5-year-olds what systemic design is.
I mean, this reminds me, Gerald, because I know you've brought up the Chinese medicine perspective a number of times, right? Where everything is connected. Is there anything in that space that could be drawn upon?
The Asian way of thinking is much more systemic than the Western ways of thinking, definitely, and also like the Indians and things like that. Yeah, it's really mostly in the Western way of world that we are stuck in this way of thinking. But unfortunately, we brought this way of thinking to the other countries, and we are not learning back from them. Yeah, definitely. Zen is very much related to systemic design. Basically, you have a triangle: systemic design, quantum mechanics, and Zen. If you do David Bohm,
Okay.
then you can really find this connection.
How do you spell his last name? Boom.
What? I didn't know
BOHM.
this.
I put it in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it was systemic design. Was it quantum?
Quantum physics, yeah.
Quantum physics and Zen?
Yeah, Zen
Wow.
Buddhism. Yeah, they all have the same. I once explained, well, a year ago, I explained my toolkit to a top Zen Buddhist from Belgium, and he was like, "It's the same."
So I'm curious, Kristel, as to, you're writing this book to explain systems thinking to, you said 5-year-olds, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a challenge. One of the important, tough aspects about systemic design, one of the tough concepts, is this concept of leverage. So how would you explain leverage to a 5-year-old?
Oh, I think he will be making a system map with stones, and
Okay.
suddenly some of the stones start to glow.
Some of the stones start to, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the concept of leverage is something, a small input of something has an outsized impact on the rest. So
Yeah.
so how is the glow?
So the glow will then spread to the other.
Got it. That's the afterglow. Fantastic.
Yeah. The glow and afterglow. I think they will get it immediately.
Yeah, glow and afterglow. Yes, I get it now. So when will that book be out?
I don't know. After the other book, I think, because it's a lot of work. Because together with while making the book with Peter, we are changing a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of work. We are rethinking all the tools. So yeah.
Okay.
Kristel, I'm coming back to this clerk judges thing because it's like behavioral and interpersonal dynamics. Are you aware of a Dutch author called Jan Jacob Stam?
No.
Because he wrote like a book, The Wings of Change. And these are things that could exactly help with this, because that's the systemic coaching field, and that goes more to interpersonal relationships.
Okay.
And you have always 3 forces at play, which is order. A certain system has a leading principle, so you have a certain order of function, who does what, to let the whole do what it needs to do. Then everybody needs to belong. If somebody not gets the place to really belong to a system, they cannot do what they need to do. And then the third force is exchange. How do they exchange between each other? And that's, I think, also with the clerk and the judges, how do they exchange? What are their functions in the whole? And what's the belonging? Do they feel that they're in the right place? So
that's interesting. I will look at it. Thanks.
So winds of change, you said?
Wings of change.
Yeah.
Oh, wings of change.
Wings of change.
Others in the group, questions?
Running out of questions?
Then I'm going to
Maybe one more from my side, maybe, but I think maybe Maish was already thinking of it. Because I saw on your website, Kristel, you're doing a lot of trainings, but I see there are now more for the PM in Belgium time, so that's midnight, middle of the night in Singapore. I'm guessing that Maish is already thinking of doing a training here with Singapore hours, so I would be very, very interested in following training from you around systemic design.
Well, the upcoming one, we adapted the hours because we had questions from North America, so that they can also follow. So we change always, we shuffle. Yeah.
So the one we took, it was I think it was 9 p.m. Singapore time.
Mhm.
That's feasible.
Actually, I have a question, and this is with regards to, and I think we asked this some time ago, is that do you see some interest? I mean, is the interest growing in systemic design from, especially from commercial or private organizations? You mentioned that, but do you see that is the interest growing? Are people coming to you and asking that, I think I have a complex problem and I need these kind of services? Or is it still something that we have to push? So you are pushing.
Well, the government and social organizations, they really come to us and they say we have a complex social problem and we want systemic design.
Okay.
The industry comes to us, we have a complex problem because we are known for that. And then in the intake, we try to understand if the complexity is on the level of just interaction design, product design, or its complexity within the service deliverable, or if it's complexity in the whole system, in the organization, in the society. And then we try to see in a discussion if there is space to go that way. But we feel for industries, you cannot push them. You cannot say to them, you need systemic design. It's too early. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I'm just going to the Slido and I'm just going to take some questions. The top rated question, Kristel, is this: systemic design has its tools and processes, but as a practice, would it be fair to say systemic design is more of a mindset?
Yes, of course. It's all the way of thinking, of looking at what you are doing as a designer. For me, when I discovered this, I was really angry on myself. Like, how could I not see this before? Because once you make the shift, it's so obvious. But it's really strange that it took so long.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's that sudden burst of realization that we have, and it seems like, and I've seen this phrase used in many places from those people who are describing systems, is saying that once you start seeing it in that way, there's no going back.
No, there's no going back.
So there's a warning to all of us over here. Once you start seeing the stuff, you start seeing the connections, you start seeing the second order and the third order, you start using the words like spillover effects. Well, there's no going back, right?
And it's sometimes frustrating because you still have clients who ask you just to design, for example, a service, and you see that it's not the right level, but you still have to do it.
Right. Right.
And then I always try to glitch in some tools to nudge them towards systemic design without them knowing it. Okay. I just tell them it's service design.
Right. Actually, that's a wonderful way. So, service. I mean, you mentioned product design and you mentioned interaction design, but it seems service design, because of it just has this a broadening view that it is more related to systems design or systemic design. Is it true? Would you say
Yes,
that way?
it's already opening up here, because it's also already more about the relationships within the system, between the touch points in that case.
Right.
Yeah.
So you would say that there's more affinity with service design to systems design than, for example, interaction design.
Yes, well, interaction design, when you speak about applications, you also have this link to systems thinking, because you also have a lot of relationships in applications.
Mhm.
For example, between even the data model in UX design has a lot of same concept as the systemic design, as the systems map.
Right. I know Wolf will have to say a lot about this because we were just talking about this right now. Wolf, there you go. Systemic design is
Yeah.
the data model as well.
Of course, I mean, these are all systems that connect to each other, right? I mean, it's just a matter of what layer we're looking at it.
And also in games, people are using systemic design principles to design games, where basically they design agents and they design the activities and the actionables that these agents have, and then they just let it go. They don't even know themselves what the outcome will be.
Okay.
They just let the system work. There is a very nice video on that by Mike. Oh, Mike. Let me see. It's a game designer.
I mean, if you're looking at the game of life, right, it's probably the smallest encapsulated system design piece that you could think of, right?
Wait, let's see if I find this.
So actually, it reminds me of this random book I picked up almost like 10 years ago. And I downloaded the software and I played with it. And the book was called Turtles, Termites, and Traffic Jams. I don't know if anyone has played with that. So I just put it in the chat window. It was called Turtles, Termites, and Traffic Jams. And it was an odd looking game where, a dot represented an ant, for example, or a termite. And it had rules. And another colored dot represented food. And you would create, let's say, 10,000 green dots, which were ants, and 10,000, some dots with food. And you would spray the land with pheromones, which is the scent that the ants follow, and you let the system run. And then you would analyze the system to see which ant would stumble upon the scent and find the food, and then how all of the ants would go and find the food. So would
that's the game, the guy behind Loopy who designed that.
So his name was Michael Resnick. Mitchell Resnick.
So I put the name of the guy in the chat. It's Mike Sellers.
Okay. Mike Sellers.
Yeah. You have also to look at the games from Nikki Case.
Nikki, Nikki? Okay,
yeah.
Okay, got it. Nikki Case. Fantastic.
Kristel, coming back to this 5% of the population, because I do systemic coaching, talking about systemic leadership, because you can be a better leader if you're in touch with the system around you, not with the individual people you're collaborating with. But then I always stumble on the fact that I use the word systemic because nobody understands what I'm trying to convey with systemic. So how do you avoid using the word systemic when talking about systemic design? To maybe persuade a couple more than 5% of the population.
You can talk about the whole.
Yeah.
You can, what I also do to people to help them understand the principle is there was this video of Russell that was also in the mail, I think, of Russ Eckhoff. And when I
yes.
show this to people, they have like, oh yeah, I get it. Especially when he explains that when you cut off your hand, it cannot write by its own. So yeah.
Okay, good. Good reminder.
But we often disguise systemic design under the label of strategy.
Can you explain more?
Well, it's especially when we are working with organizations, we just say it's a strategy to think about organizational change, but we don't say we use systemic design. Because basically the client doesn't care. He wants an outcome. He doesn't care which methodology is behind it. But strategy resonates more.
Okay, that's a good tip. Thank you. I have a question on Slido. It says, every human being has inherent biases. What is a systemic way to uncover blind spots when it comes to seeing the whole picture?
Well, that's a tough one because we still have to find this out. We are looking at bias models and seeing if we can make a tool out of this. Well, one of the things we do for the moment is make sure there is enough diversity in the room so that the participants can discover the blind spots from each other, which is not always easy because people who are willing to participate to those kinds of co-creation workshops are mostly rather highly educated, and yeah, and you can miss out a lot of other people. Even when we did the workshop about integration, all the people we got in the workshops were people from civil society organizations with an education background, but nobody really that lives the system. So it's a tough one. We still have to work on that. Yeah.
I think to add to that point, and it goes back to us discussing about government-funded social sector work. So here in Singapore, a lot of the social work is government-funded, and the government, of course, wants to know that money is being spent well. So they end up actually regulating it very tightly, and this funding model kind of turns things into ever decreasing circles in terms of what you can do. And Meish and I actually spoke to a head of a charity the other day who, how did he describe it, Meish? He said that the charities, because of the limitations of their funding, actually become resellers of the government model. They perpetuate the limitations of the model because they need the money. And only when you have a charity or someone who is fortunate enough, let's say, to get philanthropic funding, they can actually break that cycle and demonstrate that if you do it a different way, you can actually get the gains that you say you want, but that your actions actually don't support. So I think a lot of that also may come down to, like we said, it's mindset and awareness. Do you want to see? I mean, we've been also discussing this, the topic about dark matter by Dan Hill. Do you want to see the less tangible, tacit bits of information? It could be relationships, as you say, Kristel, right? What is the binding or repelling forces between the more obvious components, and ignore them at your own loss or the system's loss? So how does that all work? And those factors do not fit well with government metrics, which are tied directly back to funding. So we are actually being asked now to try and work with a couple of charities to think about how to sort of manage this negative trend.
Do you see the same in Belgium, Brussels, in your side, Kristel?
Well, it's quite a long question here. I don't know if I grabbed everything, but do I understand it that there is a kind of balancing loop that gets the system stuck in the conventional way of doing?
Yes, so actually the loop unbalances the system, you could say, from what it should be to what it is.
Yeah.
And what it is that funding requirements limit good work being done.
So it reminds me of the Cobra effect, Kristel.
Mhm.
It's a problem, and there's a clear-cut or at least clear-cut way of trying to address the problem. But I think government is feeling the heat of the unintended consequences right now, simply because the outcomes are just not what they wanted. And it is because of that funding model, because the funding model perpetuates that kind of thinking.
I will start to try if you can make loops out of them. They can be reinforcing loops or balancing loops, and to make the client understand just loops, just these are forces that are happening in the system. And that's why it's not working.
Right.
Kristel, question again. Like in systemic coaching, they talk a lot about, or one person talks about, you have your analytical brain, it's very result oriented, but you don't see all the connections. That's why you tap into the systemic brain, which is the key partner of your analytical brain. And then you get all the connections, you see all the interactions, you see dynamics. And I think that was what comes to the surface as well with systemic design, and how difficult or easy is it for you if you do this entire mapping and you see where everything is moving, to then go back to an analytical mindset and really make actionable next steps without falling in the trap of the complexity or getting lost in the trees and not seeing the forest anymore? How does that go for you? The systemic versus analytical mindset, action versus understanding?
Well, the thing is that the system map helps you with that. Huh? From the systems map, you could have like 200 factors, but the systems map will show you which of the 20 are the most important ones for the moment, which have the most potential for change, and then you start working on them. And often for the clients, we then make a new map only with the leverage points. So that's easier to grab for them. But
and maybe go ahead.
No, I was just thinking when you said about those coaching. I had a discussion a month ago with somebody in Canada, and apparently they are discovering in an American university that there is a part in the brain that is making you feel comfortable. Well, that there where the comfort things are how do you say it? Coming in, and there is another part of the brain that has to do with change, and that is linked with panic, and they are absolutely not connected to each other, what makes it very difficult for people to feel comfortable with change. And apparently there are techniques, and they are investigating that can help to connect those two brain parts. So that could help in coaching sessions to make people comfortable with change, because again, apparently only 5% of the people have those connections in their brains and can handle change without panicking.
I would be personally very interested in that, because I went from a corporate career to an entrepreneurial career, and I must say the change scares me as well from time to time. So that would be very interesting course. Now, maybe one more provocative question, Kristel, because they also say in systemic coaching, you have your cerebral mind and your analytical thinking, but most of the systemic input comes via the body, via somatic experience, somatic knowledge, empathic knowledge, gut feeling. How much of that knowledge do you leverage in systemic design, or is it still very cerebral?
Well, we try more and more, but it's still experimental to let people feel the system. For example, by really doing role play and feeling the forces in the system with their body. Because that really helps. Yeah.
It's very similar to Constellation, where people
Yes.
represent people and companies, and then they,
yeah.
Okay.
Coming back to the systems mapping, Kristel, you mentioned that it's an extremely it's a crucial activity, but also difficult because there are many people involved. Many people use this software called Kumu, and you've also recommended it. So how, I mean, I know you have a preference for doing systems mapping face to face, but do you see value in Kumu?
But Kumu is a way to digitalize your system mapper. It also helps you. What I did lately, I did an experiment. I read papers. I put all the relationships that were in those papers in an Excel sheet. And I imported in Kumu to see what the relationships came out, what system map came out. And it was interesting to see because then it was not about my bias or what I heard. It was just what the data was telling.
Okay. And so so Kumu, I'll just put it up on the chat window. It's a software that is specifically oriented towards drawing these system maps. It works on the cloud, and it is built on these relationships. And like what Kristel mentioned, you can either do these relationships on Excel and just put it into Kumu, and you can get the map, and then you can focus on the areas that you think you want to focus on. But what I hear you, Kristel, is saying that you shouldn't start there because a lot of stuff happens in a face-to-face manner, and once you try to get the shape of the map in a physical setting, that's when I think you can take it to Kumu and perhaps take it there and analyze it further.
Yeah, I prefer to mess around with post-its first.
Okay.
But then on Miro it works too.
Right.
You can also, you're more free on Miro to understand the factors, etc., than on Kumu.
Okay. So I'm just going through. Maybe we take the. I know it's 5:21. Maybe we can have the last few questions. Anyone with the last few questions? I can go to the board otherwise.
So we were saying, Kristel, that only 5% of people get systems thinking, and you need to be, if I'm using the right term, a bit of a polymath in a way, right? You need to be interested and able to understand all the variables. So when you are choosing people to participate in an activity, do you have, or do you need to set sort of a line, right? Do you have to sort of make a judgment call whether this individual, for whatever role, is actually able to contribute or not able to contribute? Is that an important factor, or is it okay to let people, even with less ability, be involved?
Yeah, they should be involved. And that's where the tools come in. Eh? They don't need to understand systems thinking to use the tools. So that's you as a designer. You have to know them very well. You have to understand systems thinking very well to be able to make the conclusions afterwards. But your participants don't.
So Sherry, you have a question?
It's not my question, but I saw it on Slido and I'm very interested to hear, which is how can organizations scope or initiate a systemic design project?
So the scoping would be what kind of what do they need to know in order for them to write an RFQ for a systems or systemic design project?
It's more that they should have this mindset change already. They should understand that there is this complexity in the organization and that they cannot solve their issues in a conventional way. They have to understand that. I think that's the most important thing. They have to understand that also in organizations, everything is influencing each other. And that there is also in organizations a behavior emerging from the whole.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So actually, I was just thinking about this whole systemic design process that you showed earlier on, Kristel, is that, and comparing it to, what typical mindsets are there around interaction design or service design or even design thinking. Like here, to be completely honest, a lot of the design thinking work in Singapore revolves around a workshop, right? So somehow it's always a workshopy thing. So it means that there's a few questions, you get the right people inside, you ideate, and hopefully there's some pointers moving forward, and that's it. So design thinking in Singapore, I think mostly because of all the RFPs that we see, kind of equated to a workshop. Interaction design is always equated to a mobile app or a website, and so it's all on the interface. And service design is the one that is, okay, we take a look at multi-channel, omni-channel stuff. So, but if you take a look at the process from your systemic design process, it seems that we can gain value from every step of the process, right? So if it's the framing, then it's, at least we understood the stuff. If it's listening, that means we got inputs from different stakeholders as to how they are seeing the system from their point of view, right? So it seems that there is a really tangible, or we can make progress from each step of the process. So it does it really necessarily mean that every systemic design project ends up with a bunch of interventions? Or do people stop with saying that, okay, I got this right now, and can I do something with it?
Well, these are interventions. I got this right now, and this I should do with it.
So they can actually jump straight in and say, okay, I understand this now. I got this aha moment. I go ahead and
yeah, you don't have to do all the steps, but
okay.
Beware. An error I see a lot of times is people do workshops, and then they literally take the ideas of the workshop to the solution.
Okay.
And I always explain to my team that it's like being the designer. It's like being a cook. You have those workshops to understand which are the preferred ingredients. But then you still have to cook. And there are lousy cooks and there are chief cooks. And you want to be a chief cook.
Got it.
So it's very important that you take the time after a workshop to take all this input on another level. And that takes experience.
Right. Thank you. One of the other takeaways, Kristel, from our previous engagement was that when it comes to interventions, it's never one intervention. There's never the single silver bullet that will solve all the problems. It's a series of interventions. And that's, again, sometimes very difficult for clients to grasp that, it's not one thing. There are like 7, 8 things that you need to do.
Well, the thing is that if you look at the system map, the problem arises from interaction between different parts. So it's logic that you cannot solve it by just fixing one part. You have to fix different parts and different connections together, and only then the change will happen.
Okay, fantastic.
Kristel, is it then feasible? Like you talk about, what the good ingredients are? Because often they speak now, design thinking goes hand in hand with agile, with lean, because they're all iterative, they have learning cycles, being learners, testing, MVPs, all these things. So is it also feasible after a systemic design process and you have the right system map, what are the spicy ingredients are, to then go work in an agile way or in a lean way, like build, measure, learn? Is that feasible, or is that too concise to convert?
No, you can do build, measure, learn, but about you should avoid is to start with one intervention, do a test around that, grow it, then take the second intervention, then take the third intervention. Because that's often what my client asks, and that's often also what they do in the lean. That's they just, I call it started with the toilet and then later at the kitchen on it, and then at the end you come up with a house.
That's
So
not the right way, you say. You need to
that's
go
not
in
the right
parallel
way.
then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you should do everything a little bit together.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
make it grow together, because otherwise you will miss the relationships. You will miss how they influence each other. But it's iterative. It's about experimenting very much. Yes.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
And I presume you can put your build, measure, learn cycle on top of that, and you want that there, right? Because you want to measure the impact of your
Yeah, of course.
and learn from that. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, as long as you're doing them together.
Yeah.
And then my analytical brain goes a bit south because I've been taught always to work monovariably, but yeah, that's then the Cartesian way of working. So where you then change you change the kitchen, you change the toilet, you change the staircase, but then you go in the house and the light doesn't work. So how then, what interventions you make? You then again start pushing all the buttons, or what you do then? Because
you see with your measurements how your system app has been evolving, and you do the analysis again. Are there new leverage points popping up? Are there other ones who are not important anymore? Yeah.
Wesley, I think, at least for me, I usually call this an architectural thinking. It is about thinking, if I want to build a house, I have to think about it from many, many different dimensions, right? In terms of, sure, who's the people living in there, to how do I get to it, where does it sit in the cityscape, and all of these things. And I think, I completely agree there with Kristel. Like the typical or the traditional, especially software approach, can become very, let's just build the first room and then build from there. And instead, you essentially need to build everything a little bit. Ironically, when agile done correctly, that's actually what it does, right? I mean, it always says, if I want to have a transportation piece, I'm going to first make maybe a kick roller, and then a bicycle, and a motorbike, then a car. So technically all the pieces are in there. But yeah, I can't just make one tire.
Yeah, indeed.
Fantastic. Look, it's been fantastic, Kristel. We are at 5:30 here, Singapore time. Thank you so much for your time. Do you have any questions for us?
Oh yeah. What do you think about systemic design now?
So perhaps maybe I should pick people out from the things. So Alex, is Alex there?
Yes, Mish, hello.
Hi, Alex. Maybe you're the right person for this question.
Okay, I'm not sure why, but all right. No, I mean, systemic design, it makes sense, right? It's really about the ecosystems, and this is something that we have learned to our pain, really, in the couple of projects that we've been doing with you guys. Obviously, that whenever you try and change one thing, you can go on infinitely and change all the other things as well. So the real challenge, of course, is how you bring that back to ground level, and you have to ask yourself, where do I stop? Because in a perfect world, if you had a blank slate, you could redesign everything, you could push everything through, you could look at where's the most efficient way to intervene and things like that. But as we've seen in some of the journeys, right, there are things that are just out of our control. There are things that belong to stakeholders that are just not going to move. So that's really where the rubber hits the road. We can have the best models in the world. We can have the best structures for thinking about it. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of the time is thinking, what can we actually change in a reasonable amount of time and a reasonable amount of cost within a sphere that we can control, and that we're not dependent on others to allow us to change things.
Fantastic. So actually, Kristel, is there a concept of a minimum viable, instead of a product, minimum viable system?
Well, the concept is that you build every intervention that you were thinking up in a minimal way.
Okay, so it's the same thing. Okay, got it.
Yeah, what's the minimal event? What's the minimal, you don't, for example, you don't want to build an application right away. Can we do something manual that does the same, for example? Yeah. But to respond to the previous comment of Alex, when it's true that often you need other players in the system, but you can plant seeds. For example, now the exercise I'm doing to look at how justice can move to care, no way that tomorrow the care system will be connected in Belgium with the justice system. But at least you show this possibility and people will pick it up and eventually it will be there.
Yeah, so it is about, I suppose, from the system designer's perspective, it's really about, in a sense, being positively exposed to randomness. You've just got to plant the seeds, and you never know when someone will actually water your seed and grow it, and it takes a lot of time. But I suspect it also depends on the culture. Some societies, you may get better results going from bottom up, from a grassroots up movement. In more hierarchical societies, I suspect you would probably get more traction if you manage to shift one person at the top. That's what we're trying to do in Singapore also. If we can get our ideas to people right at the top, hopefully they can drive the organization. But really what I'm trying to do, what we're trying to do here in the judiciary, the way that I look at it is I look at it as what I call an alligator approach. It's like the jaws of an alligator. I'm trying to do a little bit of bottom up, pushing whatever people that I can to change small things that are within their control. And I'm also trying to get to the top level so that the top level people then push the approach down. And I'm hoping that somewhere between these two approaches, something will move.
That's what I do too, but I also make sure that they talk to each other and learn from each other.
Okay. Fantastic. Let's see if Callie, you're still there, or we tried to get you last time.
I was in between meetings. I do apologize. Yes,
No
I've got this thing recorded so that I can look at it later.
Okay, yeah, we can send it
Yeah.
to you. So Callie leads design, the design practice or design practice at ITE. So Callie, systemic design, part of the curriculum next?
I think you will start by us living it out first, and then you will appear in the curriculum very, very soon. That's how I look at it. Well, I think that for me, it is, I mean, what has been described is actually a description of reality anyway, right? I mean, everything, yeah, you know, reality is that we live in a system, and the system starts with individuals, and individuals in teams, and the teams to society and community, and then that's how we interact. That's how I see it. And unfortunately or fortunately, whenever we deal with it, we all try to deal it in a more simplified form. So I like the fact that a good reminder that we should just prototype bits of the whole system rather than bits of part of the system or the whole of part of the system. I think that's really a good paradigm shift there.
I love your phrase over there is it's just like reality. It is.
Yeah, it is. It is bits of reality. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
As you're doing a parallel with reality, it reminds me of the systems like the weather systems, for instance, which is deterministic, but still not predictable. So is it so similar to the weather system? It's possible to make a prediction on weather, but the further away you go from today, and the more blurry or inaccurate will be your prediction. So going back to the systems you were describing, is it possible that sometimes you have the visibility only on a certain amount of time, and on a longer period, the effect of the design might be totally different? And in this situation, how do you handle it?
Well, yes and no, because the system has a purpose, and this purpose is visible. For example, the weather system has as a purpose to keep the planet into balance, which is now we are over. The system is coming into overdrive and there is a risk that the weather system will become out of balance. But there is this purpose, so you could measure the balance for the planet. You cannot measure it's difficult to measure the individual the individual outcomes on a longer term, but the total outcome is quite measurable. Well, that's for what I understand until now. It's continuous learning, this stuff.
Wow.
That
Yeah,
sounds a
I guess
little bit
if I
like
see-
psychohistory. Sorry.
If I see things like that, I probably don't look at the system from the correct angle.
Can you explain?
Because, for instance, in my example with the weather system, I was saying, yeah, so we cannot predict it. But you're right saying that, in fact, the whole system, we can predict where it's going. And it's only if I focus on individual states or parts of the system that I cannot predict it. But as a whole thing, we know how it reacts and we know that what the state will be.
I also know there are a bunch of people in academics trying to make this more data-driven, and they are making like models where you can really more see all those influences on the whole.
Okay.
Delft, amongst
sorry?
others. Delft University is working on that.
I assume that the problem of prediction becomes there of incompleteness of model, right? I mean, either data or model. Correct?
But if you go back to the 70s, the Club of Rome made a model, and they were pretty right. Huh? If you read their report again, everything that's happening now, they predicted by this model in the 70s. So it's kind of not impossible.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to say impossible or not. It's to Maxime's question about ability to predict, especially on a smaller level impact, right? That then it's a matter of, do we have all the pieces in our model that we need to in order to be able to predict?
Well,
yeah, but in that case, you know, only after you do the mistake that you didn't have all the pieces, you didn't know it before.
So sense and respond, I guess. Okay, it's been a fantastic time. Wonderful, wonderful way to spend a Friday evening. I'm pretty sure all of us are going to really enjoy whatever drinks we're going to have now. After this, it's going to give us a lot of conversations to take forward. So I'd love to thank you, Kristel, for taking this time to explain and describe systemic design. So we'd like to follow up. Yes, you mentioned about the toolkit. How else can we follow up? Can we, reach you through LinkedIn or email, or what's the best way to follow up with you?
Oh, LinkedIn is good.
LinkedIn. Okay, so we'll post the LinkedIn address on the chat window. And again, yes, there it is. Thank you very much. I hope to see you again soon.